The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, but the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you uneasy. The wooden benches creaked beneath us, a constant reminder that we weren't just spectators. We were players in whatever was about to unfold. My name is Daniel Reed, a claims adjuster from the quiet town of Harpersville, South Carolina. I've never been the type to make waves. I pay my taxes, I hold the door open for strangers, and I always obey the speed limit. Yet somehow, I found myself sitting in that jury box, tasked with deciding the fate of a man who, from the moment he was wheeled into the room, seemed doomed to fail. His name was Marcus Grant. He was in his early 40s, a black man with tired eyes and an expression as hard as granite. He didn't fidget or glance nervously around the room like most defendants I'd seen in the movies. Instead, he sat motionless in his wheelchair, hands resting on his lap, face unreadable. The charges against him? Fraud. They claimed he had forged documents, stolen money from the government, manipulated the system to enrich himself. The evidence, we were told, was ironclad. Presiding over the trial was Judge Howard Greaves. The moment he entered the room, the air seemed to tighten. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his black robe like armor. There was something cold in his gaze, calculated, as if he'd already made up his mind before anyone had uttered a word. The way he looked at Marcus wasn't the way a judge should look at a man on trial. It was the look of a predator watching its prey. And then there was Calvin Morris, the prosecutor. He was sharp, well-dressed, and walked with the smug confidence of a man who knew he couldn't lose. His opening statement painted Marcus as a criminal mastermind, someone who had played the system like a fiddle. Every word rolled off his tongue smoothly, and by the time he finished, it felt like we were no longer being asked to decide Marcus's guilt. We were just there to watch the inevitable unfold. I glanced at the other jurors. Some nodded along with Morris's words, others just sat there, resigned and silent. No one seemed to question what was happening. No one looked at Marcus. But something felt off. Too neat. Too perfect. Real cases are messy. There are gaps, inconsistencies, mistakes. But this was seamless, as if someone had carefully orchestrated every detail. I shifted in my seat, suddenly uncomfortable. I didn't know what was coming, but one thing was certain: this wasn't justice. It was something else entirely. The morning sun filtered through the narrow courthouse windows, casting thin streaks of light across Marcus Grant's face. He hadn't moved since the trial started, not a twitch, not a sigh, not a flicker of emotion. Just silence. That silence was beginning to gnaw at me. Calvin Morris rose from his chair again, his movements sharp and deliberate. He smoothed his tailored suit, then picked up a folder from the prosecution's table. A folder as pristine as the one he'd flaunted earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morris began, his voice smooth as silk, "this document proves that Marcus Grant knowingly forged government aid forms to collect thousands of dollars in taxpayer money." He paused, giving us time to absorb the weight of his words. He held the folder high before flipping it open with dramatic flair. Inside was a stack of crisp documents, too crisp. No creases, no scribbled notes, no coffee stains or fingerprints. They looked fresh off the printer. Perfect. Too perfect. "This," Morris continued, "is Marcus Grant's signature. His own writing, undeniable proof that the defendant lied and stole from hard-working Americans." I stared at the paper from across the room. Even from a distance, something about it didn't sit right. The ink was bold. Too bold for a signature that had supposedly been written months ago. The penmanship was flawless, identical across every document. Identical. As someone who's filled out countless insurance forms over the years, I knew how messy signatures could be. The pressure of a ballpoint pen shifts. Letters lean differently depending on how tired your hand is. And no two signatures ever look exactly the same. Yet here was a whole stack of documents, each signature as identical as if they'd been stamped on by a machine. My gaze shifted to Marcus. His face remained stone cold, eyes locked on the table in front of him. It wasn't the face of a guilty man hoping no one would notice the cracks. It was something else, something closer to frustration, or maybe even quiet defiance. I wasn't the only one feeling it. I noticed the juror 2 seats down from me, a retired teacher named Frank, shifting uneasily. His fingers tapped nervously against his knee. Our eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, I knew he felt it too. Something was wrong here. Mr. Grant, Morris said, stepping closer to the defendant's table. Do you deny that this is your signature? Marcus finally looked up, his eyes cold and steady. No, he said. I don't deny that's my name. Morris grinned, a flash of white teeth behind a thin smile. Then you admit to the fraud? Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice calm but firm. I admit that someone wanted it to look that way. The room seemed to shrink. For the first time since the trial began, I felt something shift, a ripple of discomfort sweeping across the courtroom. Even Morris faltered for a second, his smug grin tightening. That's enough, Judge Greaves barked from the bench, slamming his gavel down hard. The evidence is clear, and this court will not entertain conspiracy theories. His eyes narrowed, and he shot a sharp glance at Marcus, as if daring him to push further. But Marcus didn't push. He just leaned back in his wheelchair, folding his hands in his lap once more. Calm, controlled, unshaken. I glanced toward Marcus's lawyer, Leonard Pratt. The man looked weary, like someone who had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. But now there was something else in his face. Hope, maybe. Or determination. He stood up slowly, adjusting his glasses as he approached the bench. Your Honor, Pratt began, his voice firm despite the tension. Given my client's statement, I believe there's sufficient reason to examine the evidence more closely. If there's even a possibility that these documents were forged, that's enough. Judge Greaves snapped, his voice like ice. He slammed his gavel down again, hard, almost violently. I will not allow this court to be turned into a circus. The evidence has been reviewed and verified. We are moving on. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right, and Greaves knew it. His refusal to even allow questions about the evidence wasn't just unfair. It felt desperate. I clenched my hands beneath the jury box, fingers digging into my palms. I wanted to speak up, to say something, anything, but I didn't. Because I knew what would happen. Greaves had already dismissed Pratt like a child playing pretend. If I challenged him, if any of us did, we'd be shut down just the same. As the next witness took the stand, I stared at Marcus once more. He wasn't just fighting the accusations against him. He was fighting something bigger, something powerful. And for the first time, I realized that if someone didn't stand up soon, this wouldn't be a trial. It would be an execution disguised as justice. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The morning's tension still lingered, clinging to the walls like smoke. Every eye was fixed on Judge Howard Greaves as he shuffled his papers. A calculated pause before delivering his verdict. The gavel stood idle in his right hand, fingers tapping impatiently against the polished wood. I swallowed hard, sensing the weight of what was about to happen. Marcus Grant sat in his wheelchair, shoulders square, hands folded in his lap. He didn't flinch, didn't stir, just watched. If he felt fear, he didn't show it. His calmness gnawed at me. Either he was the most composed man I'd ever seen, or he knew something the rest of us didn't. Ladies and gentlemen, Greaves began, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. We've heard the evidence presented by both sides. The facts are clear. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant, his gaze sharpened on Marcus, is guilty. The words struck like a hammer. The room didn't explode into chaos, no gasps, no murmurs, just silence. Cold, suffocating silence. I felt the pressure building in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath too long. I knew this was coming, we all did, but somehow, it still felt like a punch to the gut. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the other jurors. They sat still, unmoving, their faces blank as if they'd already accepted their role in this farce. They had been cowed into silence. Just like I had. Leonard Pratt, Marcus's lawyer, shot to his feet. Your Honor, I must object. This ruling is premature. There are glaring inconsistencies in the evidence. The signatures. Enough. Greaves barked, slamming his gavel down so hard it seemed to rattle the walls. His face twisted with cold authority. I will not allow this courtroom to descend into baseless speculation. The evidence has been examined thoroughly, and I have made my decision. Pratt's mouth hung open like he was about to argue further, but one sharp glare from Greaves made him think twice. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into his chair. I felt the anger rise in my chest, a tight, burning frustration that I couldn't shake. This wasn't justice. It was control. Greaves wasn't just a judge. He was a tyrant in a black robe. And we were all expected to play along. The bailiff stepped forward, preparing to escort Marcus out of the courtroom. Still, Marcus didn't move. He remained seated, his expression calm and unreadable. "Mr. Grant," Greaves snapped, "I suggest you cooperate before I hold you in contempt." For the first time all day, Marcus's lips curled into something that resembled a smile. Not smug, not bitter, just quiet, unsettling confidence. "No," Marcus said evenly, "not yet." Greaves's expression darkened. "I don't think you understand your position here." "Oh," Marcus replied, his voice steady, "I understand it better than you think." Then, with deliberate slowness, Marcus unfolded his hands and pressed them against the armrests of his wheelchair. I watched in disbelief as he braced himself, then rose to his feet. Smoothly, strongly, effortlessly. The room froze. Someone in the gallery gasped sharp, piercing, like the air had been sucked from their lungs. A juror 2 seats down from me whispered, What is this?" Greaves's face drained of color. His fingers twitched over his gavel, like he still believed he could silence what was happening. Marcus reached into his pocket. For a split second, panic surged through the room. You could feel it ripple across the jurors and spectators alike. I saw Greaves's hand tighten on the gavel, as if he feared Marcus was about to pull a weapon. But instead, Marcus pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open with one fluid motion, and there it was, the unmistakable gold badge of the Department of Justice. "Marcus Grant," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Special Agent, United States Department of Justice." The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Chairs creaked, murmurs erupted, and someone in the back let out a breathless, "Oh my God." "You've been under investigation for months," Marcus said, stepping closer to Greaves. "We've uncovered the bribes, the altered case files, the innocent people you've railroaded for money and power." Greaves's face twisted into something ugly, panic mixed with rage. This is outrageous," he stammered. You can't pull a stunt like this in my courtroom." "It's not your courtroom anymore," Marcus shot back. "Not after what you've done." The courtroom doors burst open, and a wave of federal agents flooded the room. They moved fast. Greaves barely had time to shout before 2 agents seized him, forcing his hands behind his back. The clink of handcuffs filled the air. "You can't do this!" Greaves roared, thrashing against their grip. "I am the law." But no one listened. For the first time in the entire trial, Greaves's voice held no power, no weight. Just fear. The room was chaos, a storm of gasps, whispers, and stunned murmurs. The sight of Judge Howard Greaves, red-faced and thrashing against the agents who held him, was something none of us had expected. But what shook me more wasn't Greaves's rage, it was Marcus Grant, standing tall and calm in the center of the storm, the Department of Justice badge still gleaming in his hand. "You've made a terrible mistake," Greaves spat, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "This is illegal, outrageous. I demand you release me at once." Marcus didn't flinch. "Save it," he said flatly. "You know exactly why you're being arrested." Greaves's face twisted with fury. "You're nothing but a fraud," he sneered. "A con man playing dress up." Marcus's smile was faint but sharp. "A fraud?" he repeated. "Funny. That's exactly what we've got you on." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. He handed it to one of the agents, who promptly opened it and withdrew a series of documents, records, signatures, and bank statements. The agent held them high for the room to see. "These," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room, "are records from cases Judge Greaves presided over. Cases where innocent people were convicted based on fabricated evidence. Evidence," Marcus continued, his gaze hardening, "that Greaves was paid to falsify." The room erupted again. Even the bailiff, who had stood motionless throughout the trial, shifted uncomfortably. Greaves's mouth moved silently, like he was trying to form words but couldn't find any. "I've spent the last 6 months investigating you," Marcus went on. "Every time someone refused to pay you off, they ended up here in your courtroom, and they ended up losing. This is absurd." Greaves barked. "You have no proof." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. I have everything, Judge. Every account you touched, every bribe you took, all of it. Witnesses, paper trails, even recordings. Greaves's face paled. You remember Robert Whitaker? Marcus asked. The man you sentenced to 15 years for theft? Greaves blinked, then scoffed. He was guilty. No, Marcus said firmly. He was innocent. And after he refused to pay you, you buried him under a mountain of fake evidence. The agents began escorting Greaves toward the back of the courtroom. The once mighty judge struggled fiercely, his robe flaring out behind him like the tattered remnants of a fallen king. This is a mistake, Greaves bellowed. I am the law. But no one seemed to care anymore. As Greaves was dragged away, Calvin Morris, the prosecutor, stood frozen. His once polished demeanor had crumbled. His face had gone pale, his confidence evaporated. I saw him inching back toward the courtroom doors, his hand brushing against the knob. You're not going anywhere, Marcus called out. The agents shifted, turning their focus on Morris. I had nothing to do with this, Morris stammered, his voice weak. I was just following instructions. Save it, Marcus interrupted. You falsified records to match the evidence Greaves manipulated. We've got your bank statements too. Morris's knees buckled, and the agents moved in, seizing him by the arms. He didn't fight. Didn't shout. He just stared at the floor as they led him away. For a long moment, the room was still, the kind of silence that comes after a thunderclap. Then Marcus turned back toward the judge's bench. He reached down and picked up Greaves's gavel, the same one that had silenced so many innocent voices. He held it for a moment, weighing it in his hand like he was considering its meaning. Then, with deliberate care, he set it back down. Justice, Marcus muttered to himself, doesn't come from a wooden hammer. I stared at him, this man who had come into the courtroom as a victim, but had revealed himself as something far greater. A fighter. A seeker of truth. A man who had refused to let corruption win. The agents cleared the room, and the rest of us slowly filed out. The air outside felt brighter somehow, cleaner. But the weight in my chest hadn't entirely lifted. Because for every Marcus Grant who stood and fought, I wondered how many others had been crushed under the weight of silence. Marcus's words echoed in my mind as I left the courthouse. Justice doesn't come from a wooden hammer. It comes from people. People willing to risk everything to make sure the truth is heard. That day, I promised myself I'd never stay silent again. The once commanding presence of Judge Howard Greaves was reduced to a crumbling mess as the agents dragged him through the courtroom's back doors. His voice, once sharp and booming, had faded into a hoarse, desperate mutter. He clung to his robes like they were armor, as if the fabric alone could somehow restore the power he'd just lost. I'm innocent, Greaves barked, his voice cracking. This is a setup, a scam, but no one listened. For years, Howard Greaves had ruled his courtroom like a king. Cold, ruthless, and absolute. Defendants rarely stood a chance against him. He silenced defense attorneys, manipulated evidence, and twisted the law to favor those who lined his pockets. Now, stripped of his gavel, his power, and his pride, he was nothing more than another criminal being led away in cuffs. The courtroom doors slammed behind him, cutting off his final protests. The sound echoed through the room, leaving behind a stunned silence, one heavy with disbelief and relief. I turned back to Marcus Grant. He still stood near the bench, his fingers resting lightly on the gavel. Greaves's gavel. He seemed reluctant to let it go, his eyes fixed on the polished wood. There was no smugness in his face, no triumph, just quiet resolve. Agent Grant, someone called from the back of the room, one of the federal agents. A man in a dark suit with a badge clipped to his belt. We'll handle things from here. It's over. Marcus nodded, finally setting the gavel back on the bench. No, he said softly. Not yet. He turned, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto the jury box. His gaze held us. Those 12 strangers who had watched this entire mess unfold, powerless to stop it. For weeks, we had played our part, believing we were serving justice, when in reality, we had been pawns in Greaves's game. This isn't just about Greaves, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't work alone. For years, people trusted this courtroom, trusted this system, and Greaves used that trust to destroy innocent lives. He paused, looking out across the gallery. He silenced people who tried to speak up. He bullied those who resisted. And he relied on one thing: fear. The room remained deathly quiet. His words carried weight, like cold steel cutting through the air. I don't know how many innocent people Greaves sent to prison, Marcus continued. But I do know this: none of it would have happened if people had spoken up. If people had demanded to know why evidence didn't add up. If they had challenged the lies instead of accepting them. I shifted in my seat, my chest tightening. He wasn't just talking about Greaves now, he was talking about us. The jurors. The spectators. The citizens. We had all seen the signs, the fabricated evidence. The way Greaves bullied defense attorneys like Leonard Pratt into submission, yet none of us had spoken. We let Greaves decide the truth because it was easier. Safer. You don't beat corruption by staying silent, Marcus said. You beat it by standing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He scanned the room one final time, then turned to leave. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it, that justice had finally been served. But as Marcus reached the courtroom doors, a voice rang out from the gallery. What about Robert Whitaker? The voice belonged to a woman, early 60s. Her silver hair pulled back tightly. She clutched her purse in her lap like she was holding something precious. Her voice trembled. My brother, she continued, he said Greaves framed him. No one believed him. Marcus turned slowly, his expression softening. We're looking into every case Greaves handled, he assured her. We'll find out the truth. Tears welled in her eyes. He died in prison, she whispered. He never had a chance. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the chest. How many more had suffered like her brother? How many names had been lost in Greaves's pursuit of power? Marcus walked back toward her and knelt beside her. I promise, he said quietly, we'll get justice for him. For all of them. For the first time since the trial began, the room didn't feel cold anymore. The air felt lighter, as if something dark and twisted had finally been cut loose. As Marcus left the courtroom, I remained seated, thinking about everything he'd said. About the people Greaves had buried under his lies. About how easy it had been for someone like Greaves to rise to power, because people like me had been too afraid to challenge him. I made a promise to myself that day. Never again. Never again would I let fear stop me from doing what was right. Because silence isn't safety, it's surrender. And when the truth is at stake, surrendering isn't an option. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon. People lingered in small groups, murmuring quietly as they processed what they had just witnessed. For weeks, we had sat in that room, watching Greaves twist the law to suit his will. And for weeks, we had told ourselves there was nothing we could do, that justice was out of our hands. But now the truth was out, and the weight of our silence felt heavier than ever. I lingered longer than most, still sitting in the jury box, staring at the empty judge's bench. The polished gavel still rested there, a symbol of power that had once silenced so many. It seemed smaller now, insignificant, almost, as if it had never truly held the authority we had given it. You all right? I turned to see Marcus Grant standing in the aisle. The badge he'd revealed earlier was now clipped to his belt, a sharp reminder that he wasn't just the man we had pitied throughout the trial. He was the one who had been fighting for justice the whole time. I'm fine, I lied, though my stomach still twisted with unease. It's just, I can't stop thinking about how close we came to letting Greaves win. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. You weren't alone in that, he said. A lot of good people saw what Greaves was doing, but no one spoke up. Not because they didn't care, because they were scared. That's not an excuse, I muttered. We should have done something. We should have. You were in a tough spot, Marcus interrupted. People like Greaves count on that. They use fear to control people. And once they've got you scared enough, they don't even need to threaten you anymore. You silence yourself. I knew he was right. That fear had kept me frozen in my seat, kept my mouth shut even when my gut told me something was wrong. I hadn't just doubted Marcus, I'd doubted myself. What now? I asked quietly. What happens to all the people Greaves put away? Marcus's expression hardened. We dig, he said firmly. Every case he touched is under review. We're going to uncover every lie, every bribe, every false conviction. It won't be quick, but we'll get there. And what if some of those people never get justice? I asked. What if it's too late? Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering. Some of them won't, he admitted. People like Robert Whitaker, they can't get those years back. But their families deserve the truth. Their names deserve to be cleared. That matters too. His words stuck with me, not because they offered comfort, but because they didn't. There was no easy fix, no perfect resolution. Greaves was gone, but the damage he'd caused wouldn't disappear overnight. Marcus turned to leave, but before he reached the door, I called out, "Wait." He stopped, glancing back. I wanted to say, "Thank you," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "For what you did, for putting yourself on the line like that." Marcus smiled faintly, but there was no pride in it. Just quiet exhaustion. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "None of us do, not if we want things to change." He paused for a moment, then added, "Next time you see something that doesn't feel right, say something, even if your voice shakes." With that, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For a long while, I just sat there. The wooden benches that once felt so hard now seemed almost comforting, like they were holding me there, forcing me to reflect. I thought about the faces I'd seen throughout the trial. Leonard Pratt, fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. The elderly woman in the gallery, clutching her purse as she cried for her brother. Marcus, pretending to be powerless for weeks so he could expose the truth. And then I thought about myself, the man who had seen the signs but ignored them. The man who had convinced himself that silence was safer than speaking up. I stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in my legs. The courtroom seemed smaller now, less intimidating. The gavel still rested on the bench, untouched. For a moment, I considered picking it up, feeling its weight in my hand. But I didn't. Because I knew now that power didn't come from symbols. It came from people willing to stand when no one else would. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, cleaner, lighter. But I knew that sense of peace wouldn't last long. There would be more trials, more people like Greaves, and more moments where I'd have to decide whether to speak or stay silent. Next time, I told myself, I wouldn't hesitate. Because justice isn't guaranteed. It's something we have to fight for, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Weeks had passed since the trial, but the echoes of that day still lingered. The courtroom was empty now, save for the faint scuff marks on the floor where agents had dragged Howard Greaves away. His booming voice, once a weapon, had faded into nothing but a bitter memory. The story had spread fast. News outlets ran the headlines for days, corrupt judge exposed. Years of injustice revealed. Interviews with victims' families filled the airwaves. People who had once been written off as criminals now had their names spoken with sympathy. No longer whispers of disgrace, but cries for justice. I kept reading those stories. Kept following the faces of the families who had been left behind. They clutched old photographs, some smiling through tears as they remembered loved ones who'd finally been vindicated. Others stood quietly, no relief on their faces. Just grief. For them, the truth had come too late. But one story stayed with me the most, the story of Robert Whitaker. His sister, the silver-haired woman who had spoken out during the trial, had become the face of the movement to clean up Greaves's mess. She stood outside the courthouse nearly every day, calling for action, demanding answers. Her voice never faltered, no matter how tired she looked. It was on one of those days that I found myself walking past the courthouse steps. I hadn't planned on stopping, but something made me pause. She was standing at a makeshift memorial, a framed photo of Robert Whitaker propped up beside a cluster of candles. Flowers surrounded the picture, their petals beginning to wilt in the summer heat. I should have said something, I blurted before I could stop myself. She turned, startled at first, then her expression softened. "We all should have," she said quietly. "But you can't change the past. You can only decide what you'll do next." I swallowed hard. I don't know if that's enough. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes from years of carrying pain. "It has to be," she said. "Because if it's not, then what's the point?" The air hung heavy between us for a moment. Then, slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This was Robert's," she said. "He wrote it before his trial. Before Greaves ruined him." She handed me the letter, her fingers lingering on the edges, as if part of her wasn't ready to let it go. I unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded, but the words hit hard. The truth doesn't always win on its own. It needs people. People who aren't afraid to speak up, even when no one else will. For a long while, I just stood there, rereading those words. Robert Whitaker had understood something that I hadn't, something I'd been too afraid to believe. The truth isn't some unstoppable force, it's fragile. It only survives when people are brave enough to fight for it. He knew, I whispered. He knew Greaves would try to bury him. He knew, his sister agreed. But he believed someone would eventually uncover the truth. She let out a shaky breath. He believed there were still good people willing to do what's right. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. He deserved better. He did, she said. But knowing the truth is out, that matters too. It won't bring him back, but it means something. I nodded, still gripping Robert's letter in my hand. It felt heavier than paper should, like I was holding a responsibility I hadn't earned. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to ignore that weight again. A week later, I stood on those courthouse steps with Marcus Grant. The investigation had uncovered dozens of Greaves's victims, each with their own story, each with their own pain. Marcus stood tall beside them, not as a man seeking recognition, but as someone determined to make things right. This isn't over, Marcus told the crowd. Greaves was just one man. But corruption doesn't stop with one name. We need to hold others accountable, and we need to make sure this never happens again. The crowd murmured in agreement. I spotted Robert's sister standing near the front, her eyes red but focused. She wasn't just mourning anymore, she was fighting. As I stood among the crowd, I realized something. Justice isn't a moment. It's not the bang of a gavel or the flash of a badge. It's a constant fight, one that demands courage from people like Marcus, from people like Robert, from people like me. That day, I made a promise, not just to Robert's memory, but to myself. I wouldn't let silence win again. Because the truth doesn't just survive on its own. It survives when people are willing to stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The story of Marcus Grant and Judge Howard Greaves reveals a powerful truth. Justice doesn't happen by itself. It requires people willing to stand up. Even when it's hard. Too often, we convince ourselves that staying silent is safer, that someone else will speak up, that our voice won't make a difference. But silence allows corruption, cruelty, and injustice to thrive. The lesson here is that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to ask a hard question, to challenge what doesn't feel right, or to stand by someone who's been wronged. Robert Whitaker's letter reminded us that truth isn't invincible. It's fragile, and it needs protectors. For those who have lived long enough to see both fairness and injustice, this message resonates deeply. Experience teaches us that the world isn't always kind, but it also shows us that change is possible when good people refuse to back down. So, whether in your community, family, or even a small moment of everyday life, be that voice. Speak when it matters. Because truth can only win when people like you are brave enough to defend it. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder that truth and justice rely on those who dare to stand up. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about courage, resilience, and the fight for what's right. Together, we can inspire change, one story at a time.